My name is Amy Whitman, and my paper is on Job 28:23 through 28. Research indicates that the author of Job has not been confirmed. Due to the similarity to Psalms and Proverbs in language and sentiment, and the prevalence of wisdom, it is supposed by some to have been written in the time of David and Solomon. Some argue it was written by Job himself, or Elihu, Isaiah, or Moses. The use of the divine name, Yahweh, indicates it was written or at least edited by a member of God's people. Job's lifestyle reflects those of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, indicating that it was set during the same time period, circa 2100 to 2000 BC. Job was a historical person. The locations and the names are real. Job was an Arabian patriarch who resided in the land of Uz. He was a prosperous man that maintained integrity when he met a series of trials that fell upon him. The story is set in the land of Uz, an unknown location that's possibly near Edom, which is in the region southeast of the Dead Sea. The earliest mention of Job in ancient literature comes in Ezekiel, which was written in the early 6th century BC. Job, along with Daniel and Noah, are mentioned in the book of Ezekiel as three great examples of righteousness. This indicates that the story of Job was known in some form by this time and was at least circulating in oral tradition. Literary features such as vocabulary suggest that the written version of Job came to be after the Jewish exile, which was in 538 BC and before the 4th century BC. The book of Job consists of two separate portions. The bulk of the work is extended dialogue between the hero and his friends, and eventually God himself in poetic form. The poem is set within framework of a short narrative in prose form. The book falls into 5 sections: a prologue, a dialogue, speeches, and speeches of God and Job's reply, and an epilogue. The prologue of Job describes him as blameless and upright. Job is pictured as an ideal patriarch whose reward for his piety is material prosperity and happiness. Job has 7 sons and 3 daughters. Their feasting habits are described, along with Job's practice of sacrificing for himself and on their behalf, just in case he or they had sinned. Satan, the accuser, a member of God's heavenly council, acts with God's permission to test whether or not Job's piety is rooted in self-interest or whether the desire for prosperity is his real motive. Faced with the appalling loss of his worldly possessions, his children, and finally his health, Job refuses to curse God. His capacity for trusting God's goodness has made him a model of patience. 3 of Job's friends arrive to comfort him. Job debates issues of reward and punishment with his friends. At this point, the poetic dialogue begins. The picture of Job that is presented in the poetic portion is different. Instead of the patient and loyal servant of God, he is an anguished and indignant sufferer who violently protests the way God is treating him and displays a variety of moods. He cries out accusingly against God to bold confidence in which he calls for a hearing before God. The conclusion of the tale, as given in the epilogue, describes the restoration of Job. God visited him with tokens of goodness and great prosperity, more than he had prior, doubling his original possessions and allowing him to live to a ripe old age. The book of Job is considered to be a book of wisdom. It is grouped with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes as a product of the wisdom movement. Even though the hero protests vehemently against the rational ethics of sages, It is a supreme example among ancient texts of speculative wisdom in which a man attempts to understand and respond to the human situation in which he exists. Wisdom literature in the Old Testament insists that all of the creation comes from God, and that wisdom is granted by seeking God's way in all areas of life. Job has two genres, prose and the poetic dialogue. Wisdom is revealed in Job 28. This verse is a reminder that God's wisdom is beyond Job's understanding. Job uses mining as an analogy for searching for God's wisdom. God's wisdom is not found in the land of the living, but in the mind of God. My passage, Job 28, 23 through 28. God's understanding to the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for rain and a path for a thunderstorm, then he looked at the wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and he tested it. And he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. The writer of Job acknowledges that God created, knows, plans, and sees all, and that fearing of God is wisdom, and that evil should be avoided. The original audience was an Old Testament audience who had a lesson in suffering of the righteous. The New Testament is an audience are believers under a different covenant, although they still learn from the lesson. Current and ancient audiences still have the same desire to want a simple and rational explanation for all of the terrible things that happen. We cannot assume that our tragedy is due to satanic involvement. Job did not know the origins of his trouble either, and in our shared obliviousness of the cause and effect, we are comparable to Job. The theological principle in this text is that God understands, created, and tests the wisdom that believers use as a guide. God is our guide. God is sovereign. God knows all and we know little. God is always just and owes us no explanation. God expects us to trust his character and sovereignty when unexplained tragedy strikes. This principle fits with the rest of the Bible because God is our wisdom guide. We should not question why. Instead, the focus should be on God and his character. The New Testament teaching qualifies this principle with verses like James 1:5. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Christians today could and should live out this theological principle, for God is our ultimate wisdom guide. If his teachings of wisdom are understood and followed, then evil can be avoided. Thank you.